Okay, welcome everybody to the online Causal Inference seminar. Today is a special seminar again. Like a couple of weeks ago, we're doing an interview with someone who's been very influential in the causal inference literature. Last time we had Esther Duflo. This time we have Don Rubin, who's a giant in the field of causal inference. I've known Don since the early 90s when we were both at Harvard, and I learned an enormous amount about causal inference from him, and had the great privilege of actually teaching a graduate course with him on causal inference. I think first time in 95 or 96. Don's had a huge number of very influential papers on causal inference. He developed the potential outcome framework for observational studies, which is very widely used in statistics, in social sciences, everywhere where people are doing causal inference, and these days very much so in the private sector at the tech companies. And so it's a great privilege to have Don here today, and the plan is for us to ask him some questions, engage him in some conversation about causal inference now, causal inference then, and causal inference in the future. So again, welcome, Don. Great to see you.
Thank you.
I hope you're doing well in these interesting times.
Very strange times. Yeah.
So it's always good to see you. So let's get started. Guillaume, you wanna?
Yeah. Thanks, Guido. Thanks, Don, for being here. It's a pleasure to see you again. So we wanted to start with,
likewise.
Well, I guess, yeah, thank you. We wanted to start with the beginning, and in particular with the people that influenced you as you were maturing as a student and as a researcher. So in particular, you've studied under really two towering figures of their respective fields. I'm talking about John Wheeler at Princeton, who's a physicist, and Bill Cochran at Harvard. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit whether you feel the influence of these figures on your way of thinking, and whether other people influenced you in those early days.
Yeah, actually, when I looked at the questions you were going to ask, I started to think about Wheeler a little bit more in some of the other people. One thing that was left out of the questions was the fact that I was also influenced by psychologists as an undergraduate, especially at Princeton. But the other thing about Wheeler that I hadn't thought about for probably half a century is that the course that I first took with him was co-taught, because Wheeler was this towering figure, who was a protege of Einstein's and stuff, and there are photographs of him walking along with Einstein, and then he was a protege of von Neumann and characters like that. But the other person who this physics course was taught with, and they shared lectures, was a guy named Aaron Lemnick, I think. I remember the last name is Lemnick, who was a physicist, but not the star the way Wheeler was. but they shared teaching responsibilities, lecturing, and Wheeler would give the inspiring lectures, and Lemnick would give the more mundane lectures. And I think that Lemnick went on to become dean of the faculty at Princeton at one time. But one thing that I don't think I've ever mentioned this, but with this experience actually is relevant to Guido, because what it gave me an appreciation for was the wisdom of joint teaching, where people have different styles, but they're trying to they emphasize things that are important to them. But it makes, I think, a much richer learning experience when you have people sharing the stage that way, and sharing the responsibility. So that's something I hadn't thought about for half a century, more than half a century. But I think that this idea of jointly teaching with different perspectives, not exactly the same, I think is highly useful for students. as well as for the faculty doing the teaching.
Yeah, that makes sense. How about Cochrane? He was your PhD advisor.
He was a great
we
guy.
see the influence in a lot of your early work on observational studies.
That's right, because he was at the time just getting out of a fairly deep involvement in the 64 Surgeon General's report on cigarette smoking and cancer. And it's sort of interesting. There are a lot of things that were known back then that have been sort of forgotten. I mean, one thing is that everybody knew cigarette smoking caused lung cancer. That in fact, since I think even back then for 50 years, they've been called cancer sticks. So Cochrane was well aware of that, but also Cochrane was involved in doing it from the epidemiological point of view. And so at the same time, Cochrane taught experimental design from a very classical Fisherian point of view, Neyman Fisher point of view. When he got to doing observational studies, he was all about doing regression. Back then, everything was least squares regression or some modified version of it. The IV stuff had barely gotten into statistics by then, even though it was well known in economics. So Cochrane was an interesting mentor in that sense, that he had these two sort of contradictory perspectives that he never, as far as I can see at least, put together. Even in his courses, he didn't really use the randomization-based potential outcomes perspective at all. And so when I wrote that paper, I was writing things that I thought were obvious. This is the right way to think about it, and it was puzzling to me that it wasn't used. This potential outcomes perspective wasn't used in observational studies, because it seems so obvious to me.
So what did you get the sense that Cochrane was aware of the connection or the contradiction in the way he was thinking about these two problems?
I don't think so. And the reason for that is there's this book that he sort of wrote, but he didn't write. It was called, I think, what was it called again? I'm trying to remember now, but it was published by Wiley, I think, but it was published after he died, when his wife, Elizabeth, I think, went through his office gathering all sorts of things and wanted things that he was working on to be published. When I talked to him when he was still alive about why he never published on this stuff, he said, well, it's so computationally demanding to do all this matching and stuff, and he didn't think what he had written was very good, and so he decided to shelve it, basically.
I see. We'll get back to Cochrane and his views on observational studies in a little bit. But I wanted to get back to kind of the influence of your training in the early days. So you mentioned that you were influenced by psychology. I remember when I first took Causal Inference and you were teaching it. You when you introduced the potential outcomes framework, and in particular when you talked about estimate, you had this kind of like physics style approach. It's like, well, you need to define what you want to measure before the experiment. This has nothing to do with the experiment. The experiment is something that you do to get at that quantity. But the measurement instrument should have nothing to do with what you actually want to measure. Can you talk a little bit about that perspective?
Yeah, that perspective, I don't know when I first sort of realized that I had that perspective, but it probably goes back to when I was in high school. When I was really a kid, because as a kid I was taking in high school this what they call college level physics and math stuff, and I had a great physics teacher in high school, and it's just that's the way you thought. You thought about problems first, defining what you wanted to estimate, the scientific quantities of interest, and then you went around trying to measure them and estimate them. It's just a very, very natural point of view. So it's how I grew up.
Makes sense. Thanks. So we'll get back a little bit to all of these things as we go. But Dominic, do you want to move on to the early career?
Yes, thanks. So yeah, so one of your most influential papers was estimating causal effects of treatments in randomized and non-randomized studies, where you introduced or used the potential outcome framework for non-randomized studies. So I just wanted to kind of understand a little bit kind of how that paper came to be. So what motivated you to write this paper? Back then you were at the Educational Testing Service.
Right.
What was did the work there influence it? And yeah.
Well, I spent 1 year after my PhD at Harvard teaching. I think I was called a lecturer or something, and it was partially. I think I even co-teaching with Bob Rosenthal. I don't remember now, but I was sort of influenced by psychologists. When I got to ETS, a lot of the stuff just seemed obvious. The experimental design background and the potential outcomes way of thinking about cause and effect seemed obvious to me. But when I got to ETS, most of the people were psychologists. Some of them were very smart, but they weren't particularly mathy. Although the psychometricians were more like sort of mathematical statisticians in the 60s. A guy Fred Lord and another guy named Mel Novick were there. They wrote a famous textbook for psychometrics. Lord and Novick.
Lord from the Lord's Paradox.
Correct. Yeah. Fred Lord. And they got into a fight before I ever got there. And Mel Novick moved to Iowa, I think, where he started sort of a Bayesian version of psychometrics. And Fred Lord became the sort of the sole giant at ETS, in control of the destiny, sort of the way Naiman was in the early days at Berkeley. And Fred Lord was kind of a crusty guy, but at the time at ETS, when they're talking about, because they were doing educational experiments back then, and so there was a lot of discussion about experiments and how you take observational data and make it and analyze it. And the curious thing to me at the time, everybody was talking about true scores. So you couldn't do any analysis of anything without worrying about the true score. So for example, everybody takes tests. When you take a test, like for example, the SAT or something, there's a selection of items. And then the estimand there is what would have been if you'd taken all the items. But that's not quite right, because there are practice effects and there are carryover effects, and people tire. So they developed this idea of true score. What you're trying to estimate is a true score. And so you can't do anything without thinking about things in terms of this latent variable, the true score. And I got in arguments with the psychometricians there, because I said, but you don't have to think about the true score when you're analyzing data from a true randomized experiment. So why are you guys so fixated on true scores? And so basically that's one of the reasons I wrote that 74 paper, is just to point out that there's this potential outcome approach, which has been well accepted in experiments, but it also applies to causality generally. It's how you define causal effects. And so I think I was very careful about using the words causal effects rather than causality, because causality is such a funny term. What caused this is a question that I've written about a little bit, saying that's a question that has no answer. But the effect of manipulation, that's how you get down to things that are scientific. And so I originally wrote the paper just as a sort of a baby version, not trying to be sophisticated at all. And I think I tried to submit it to, I don't remember where I did now, but I certainly remember being rejected by the psychometric societies, the like Psychometrica and stuff, that they didn't like it. And so at the time I said, well, I should just get this thing published somewhere. And I had a friend who was on the editorial board for Journal of Educational Psychology, so he just said, send it here and I'll see if I can get a good review of it. I said, that's fine. I don't care.
Well, I can see that would be a very hard paper to review, because sort of, what do you make of it? What is really the contribution? At some level, it is introducing the notation and the setup, but that's a difficult thing to assess.
That's right. In fact, when I looked at the reviews, half the reviews said this is just baby stuff that everybody knows.
Yeah.
And the other half of the review said this is completely wrong. The right way to think about causality is doing regressions or maybe instrumental variables. But this is completely wrong.
Well, I doubt they were saying that at the time.
Well, it's probably a creation of mine, but they certainly rejected it. That's for sure. They don't like it at all.
Great, thanks. I think we're now gonna move over to early causal inference history. So also related to the 1974 paper, you clearly give credit to Neyman for introducing potential outcomes for randomized experiments. And there was a statistical science interview where you say that you talked to him about it, and that Neyman was not interested in applying his framework to observational studies.
Correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about Neyman's objection?
Sure, because I had a Guggenheim, I think it was probably when was it? Mid-70s. And I talked to, I think it was Mosteller, about where I should visit with the Guggenheim. And he suggested I visit Berkeley. And so I visited there, and I still remember part of the, Eric Lehman was the chairman. He was a charming guy, Swiss gentleman. And so I had my experience at Harvard with Cochran and Mosteller. And I remember one of the first things I asked Eric was, I understand, this is what I said to him, I said, I understand that you can get a PhD in statistics at Berkeley, well, without ever having seen a piece of data. And Eric looked at me dumbfounded and said, my God, I certainly hope so. And I still remember that, because the idea of data having to do with statistics, irrelevant. Because Eric didn't think it was relevant. But then the visitors had office space up on the, I think it was the fourth, fifth floor of Evans Hall. And that's where the retired faculty also had offices. And so my office was next to Neyman's, and I'd never met Neyman, but of course I'd heard a lot about him through Cochran's course and also stories, because Cochran was a great storyteller about Fisher and Neyman and the battles between Fisher and Neyman and so forth. And so I liked Neyman a lot. I mean, he was a charming guy, and although his behaviors wouldn't be considered entirely respectable these days, but he was a charming guy. Got along very well, actually.
But so just following up on Dominique's question, kind of how did Neyman see observational studies sort of for causal effect?
He basically views, and I think Guido, in our book, I think we even found a quote of Neyman's where he says, without randomization, he's talking about Fisher and randomization, and Neyman said something like in this quotation, something, one of Fisher's greatest contributions was randomization, and without it, a study has little value in assessing causality, or something like that. It's in our book somewhere. And so he was very down on observational studies. Of course, he was also a heavy smoker.
I think that was still earlier in his career. So by the time you met him, I thought he might have mellowed or changed his views on that. But
I don't think so, because when I would talk to him about, why he didn't use this potential. I asked him once about why he didn't use this potential outcomes notation, which was fabulous contribution to talk about causal effects in observational studies. And he said something, oh, that's far too speculative. Let's talk about something more scientific. Let's talk about the stars. Because when I met him, he was very, very interested in astronomy and telescopes and how you track movement of stars and relative to more distant stars, and how you calibrate telescopes. And we had the biggest, Palomar telescope, and they were building one in Hawaii too. So he was very into astronomy at the time.
So Don, Fabri here.
Yes.
So Cochrane, your doctoral advisor, had a different view on observational studies and causality. I think
yes.
That observational studies should be designed to somehow mimic randomized experiments as close as possible. So how did you?
I'm not sure that he. Actually, that's one of the questions that I was thinking about, Travis. I'm not sure he ever said that, because even in his courses, he taught a course in observational studies, and he taught 1 or 2 courses on experimental design, and they never used the same notation. And I don't know whether he ever made that comment about designing observational studies. I don't think he did, actually. He talked about how you collect data for them and how you analyze them, but I don't think I possible that he did, but I don't think he ever used the phrase designing observational studies.
So can you instead talk about Cochrane's perspective on re-randomization and how it relates to the design of observational studies, in your view?
Yeah, well, I think the closest thing is when I asked him, what should you do if you get a bad allocation? And he said, well, what Fisher said was, if you know you got a bad allocation, you should re-randomize. But of course, at the time, even back in the 60s and early 70s, the idea of doing re-randomization, like 10,000 times, and then throwing away the bad allocations a priori defined in some sense, and then randomizing from the acceptable allocations was computationally impossible. Because in fact, in one of Cochrane's classes in experimental design, or maybe it was regression, he would talk about how you invert a 5x5 matrix using the abbreviated Doolittle method by hand. Because, or a desk calculator, one thing that you plug in, you turn a crank. So it was a different era, and I think many of the guys from that era were really hampered. Their thought processes were limited, because if they had an idea that required heavy computation, they would stop thinking about it, because you couldn't do it anyway. So my impression was that Cochrane never really thought very hard about re-randomization, and in the sense, really relying on the designs like, split plot designs, or real randomized experiments where everything was done a priori and according to a rigid rule, and not letting the computer make up a complicated rule as we now have with either Mahalanobis metric for treatment minus control or something, throwing out the bad allocations. But I don't think he ever thought about that. That I think is an important bridge between observational studies and randomized experiments.
Right. I would like to ask you something that I also asked you during the statistical science interview. And it's a question related to how you view potential outcomes, as people are sometimes, they have a hard time conceiving potential outcomes, especially those that are trained in traditional statistics. So how do you think about potential outcomes? Do you think of them as fixed quantities that exist in people, or simply as a device to for causal inference and for defining causal quantities?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one that I think I've written a little about more recently, meaning in the last two or 3 years. I think it really relates to my background, starting in high school in physics. In particular, even when I was in high school, I had a little bit of quantum mechanics, and then certainly with Wheeler, that was, it was fundamental, along with relativity. And so the idea of having things, two things that exist, but you can measure either one precisely, but you can't measure them both precisely, was very natural to me. It's just that's science. Position and momentum, they both exist. You can measure either one you want, but you can't measure them both at the same exact point in time. Pick one. And so the estimands, like energy or moment or other things that you want to measure, are defined in terms of quantities that are perfectly well defined and precisely measurable, even though the compound quantity, the function you're trying to estimate is not. So again, I think this was natural to me to think of, there are these two things. Neither one defines the estimand. The difference defines the estimand, but you can never precisely measure the estimand. Well, that's life. So if I believed it when I was in high school and college, why shouldn't I believe it now? So it just seemed it was a natural way of thinking to me. So that they both exist, but you can't measure that particular function of them. So, and I think that, and I've tried in some sloppy way to see how old that idea goes. And I think, in fact, the idea that an estimand can be precisely defined, but not precisely measurable, is very much a 20th century idea, and not. I can't find any hint of it going back before the quantum mechanics, before the Copenhagen School.
Yeah, I guess we can move on to questions from Guido about.
Sure. Yeah. We talked a little bit about the 74 paper, kind of introducing the potential outcome framework, but another very influential paper is the propensity score paper with Paul. It's
right.
Partly, you actually have a whole bunch of very influential students. But can you tell us a little bit about how that paper came about? Did it start kind of with your work on missing data, or how did you?
No, actually, that's a great question. Basically, I've always been sort of very practical and wanting to do consulting, and at the time there was a psychologist, a woman named June Reinisch, who was at Rutgers, and she was doing observational studies basically on the effect of in utero exposure to hormones and barbiturates on the personality of kids. And she was using a data set that was a Danish data set. I think it was called the Plum data set or something like that. But in it, she was trying to, and because it was a psychologist, she wasn't yet into all the regression stuff. And she liked this idea of matching. And so I don't remember how I first met her, but anyway, she had this data set, and I started doing this matching stuff with her, and this does lead to the propensity stuff, because when you try to do exact matching, like this course in exact matching, which is an incredibly stupid idea, but that's what everybody was trying to do back then. And the idea that you could get a dimension reduction by doing something more intelligent really arose in the context of the matching I was doing for Reinisch, when some of the very important matching variables that you wanted to match on, well, sex was one, because you're looking at personality traits as the outcome variables, but also things like aggression that were well known to be heavily influenced by hormones, and so and other sort of rare conditions. I don't remember what some of the medical names are right now, but these relatively rare binary variables, and you want to match on them, but you didn't want to match on them exactly, because if you tried to match them exactly, you'd reduce the sample size so much that everything else you basically were ignoring all the other variables. And she probably had 10, 15 other variables that were important that you wanted to match on. So the idea of this propensity matching grew out of trying to get summaries that could create the kind of balance that you got in randomized experiments without doing exact matching. And so I was incredibly fortunate at the time to have Paul Rosenbaum around as a graduate student at Harvard, and started working on that using the Reinisch data sets as examples. And he had another data set too. I don't remember what it was right now. So, but it led to the early publications following the propensity score paper itself in I think American Statistician and JASA back then. So again, it's highly driven by an applied project, and the objective was to get good answers for the real project, and having a real data set available was extremely helpful, because you explore ideas.
Now the propensity score paper is just very nice, because it doesn't try to do too much. It's just very clear and clean. It's not like the 74 paper, and I think that's sort of partly contributed to it still being so influential. Another paper that I really like is the principal stratification paper with Konstantin Frangakis.
Constantine is another wonderful student of mine. I mean, he's super intelligent, and he has a different way of looking at problems. I think probably because of his Greek upbringing. He went to high school in Athens. His father was a surgeon, so he had some medical knowledge. I think he was an undergraduate at Imperial under David Cox. And always creatively thinking. And so the idea for principal stratification came up as a generalization of IV. I guess it was we didn't really realize it back then to the same extent, but it had so many different branches, because and of course some of the applications have nothing to do with IV itself, but it's the idea of stratifying on a partially observed quantity. So it bridges the causality and bridges missing data stuff, because it's a latent variable, it's only partially observed, and all the other stuff. But Constantine was absolutely great to work with.
So kind of these foundational papers have had a big impact kind of in the theoretical methodological literature and other disciplines as well. So in econometrics, there's a huge amount of work going on kind of on synthetic control stuff by Abadi and people on regression discontinuity things that all kind of just very directly uses the potential outcome framework.
Right.
You kind of what do you make of that literature, or kind of what?
Well, in some sense, I think I have a sort of a simple mind, because I don't like special cases, and so the whole idea of causality to me, causal inference, is trying to infer the missing potential outcomes. So that's a big idea, and it's tremendously simplifying. And then the idea of principal stratification is just, well, you want to stratify on everything that you can, that you think is related to the outcome and influences assignment. And so then you think, well, but sometimes the thing you want to stratify on is partially missing. And so but thinking about it from the large perspective, it all sort of fits together very well, I think. Whereas the special cases like the difference in differences or regression discontinuity design, I mean, they're all these little special cases. So, but they just make different assumptions. I think Guido and you and I talked about that perspective of special cases for different diff back when we first started teaching the causal inference course together. I think at least that's my memory. I don't know if it's yours.
No, I think they help in a lot of these special cases, and I see it more as people elaborating on these frameworks kind of to deal with very specific problems. But it's these basic frameworks are just very widely applicable, but you need to fine tune them for different questions.
I agree completely with that. Yeah.
Fabri and Michael, you guys want to?
So now we're going to ask a few questions about the impact of causal inference. So the first question is, what is the clearest example, or at least a very clear example, or maybe some clear examples of how causal inference models and methods have led to new scientific discoveries or public policy decisions?
Oh, that's an interesting question. For some reason, the first thing that comes to my mind is some connections I tried to make when I was in China with some of the internet guys, the for-profit companies, and the rules are sort of different there, because they do, as you know, A/B testing, but their samples they claim are so large that they don't have to worry about standard errors, and so the conversation with them sort of stopped there, because I was worrying about trying to do re-randomization or something to get more efficiency when I was doing this preparation for possible consulting, and I think they've got it wrong, because there are all sorts of other issues that arise. For example, the interference between units. The units in these internet companies are the internet, so everything's interfering with everything else, and it becomes very, very complicated to try to do stuff. So the project I've been most involved on that side is internet interference is a project that I did some work on at Lincoln Laboratories here in New England. Lincoln Laboratories is I guess a subsidiary of MIT. So for example, all the guys' emails there have MIT in them. And the project that I've worked on with was internet interference, focused primarily on Russia and China. and sites that they set up, and focused on elections, U.S. election, 16, French, Balkans and Baltic elections. And the issue there arises, they have all these sites that are suspicious. And what we mean by suspicious here is generating retweets. So they're very influential in the sense of, if you could track them, that you find out that not the initial tweets are so much, but they generate lots of retweets. And there's this, I guess I wrote a paper with these guys at Lincoln Labs that's coming out in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. I think, I don't know, maybe it just came out. But the issue there is there too many sites to investigate, because investigating a site to see who really owns it is very time consuming, and it has to be kind of manually done. So what you want to try to do is identify the potentially influential sites automatically, because they're hundreds of thousands of sites, thousands, I don't know, maybe thousands and maybe millions of sites to look through, and you can't investigate each one. And so what we did is we developed this scheme for measuring them in a relatively automatic way, and the data that we used was data was subpoenaed by Congress. And it turns out that the sites that we identified when they were followed up were all mostly owned by Russians. So I think this paper's coming out, as I said, in PNAS, maybe within the month or something. But I think that's a really important problem in the future, because it also deals with what do you mean by precision? This idea of, does a standard error work? No, because a standard error is this asymptotic idea, pushed by Neyman, really, as a summary, assuming you have a asymptotics with a normally distributed estimator that can be summarized by the point estimate and its standard error. And that's completely wrong in these situations. What you mean by precision is something far more delicate.
Mhm.
Right. I also have a question here. So you've been involved with FDA and also CDC over a long period of time. How do you think the perception and use of causal inference methods has changed over the years? And how do you think your view on causal inference has contributed to these change?
Interesting question. Again, yeah, I think at CDC, there are a lot of very good people, very wise practical statisticians.
Observational rather than FDA, more
Experimental, right? And they're at both places. In my involvement was sometimes direct with people who actually worked there, and sometimes with consulting projects with people who were trying to get, for example, a product approved at FDA, and often the people that were involved in the consulting side of it had been FDA employees. Like there's one guy named Carl Peck, who's out in California, who's in the Bay Area. He's very, he's LA area. That's right. Very, very wise guy. He was very high up at FDA. And also we have our Guido and I, our old friend Mark McClellan, who is FDA commissioner under Bush.
Yeah.
Right. And Mark, actually, he was involved in one product. I don't remember what the product was right now, but it involved a product where you had a bridge some randomized experiments with observational studies, and actually he was really good at making sure that the people sort of took this bridged approach seriously. People who worked at FDA, so that was good. And at CDC, actually, there was a woman on TV recently about all this COVID response who I don't remember her name right now, but woman who I'd met a few times, and she was at the White House, and she was, I think, about to get fired by our fearless president. But I think that these ideas have been spread by a lot of very good people at both CDC and FDA. In fact, there's one woman at FDA, I forgot, that I've actually done several short courses with her on propensity scores primarily. And she's written some really nice papers about propensity scores and their use in practice and their use for design, meaning that that you really have to use them as covariates to try to get balance in groups before looking at the outcome data. And she's written a couple of really nice papers.
So you've also
YUE is whatever it's for. Lily, you. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh,
no, I was just thinking that maybe we can skip some of the questions and
just go to the audience questions.
Sure.
Yeah, some questions and then move to the questions that are have been written on the Q&A. No?
Yeah, let's do that. Guillaume, do we want to just read out the questions, or do we want to have the people? So there was a question from Carlos Fernandez Loria. How hard was it for you to push the potential outcomes framework in the early days? I can imagine that in the early days, more than one person thought of it as nonsense.
Yeah, for some reason, maybe it's my personality, I feel fairly immune to that. I mean, yeah, people ridicule something that I think is the right way to look at it. That's okay. You know, I'll just go on pushing what I think is a good way to look at these kind of problems. And if somebody likes another approach, a graphical approach, wants to go back to drawing arrows like they did when they were in kindergarten, that's fine. Doesn't bother me. You know, I'll just keep doing what I think is the right way to do it, and let the audience determine whether they want to do it that way or not. I mean, certainly there are some circumstances where different approaches can be useful, and if people find one approach more useful than others, that's their right.
Okay, so
and there have been a variety of times, for example, people have wanted me to get into a written debate with people who have different perspectives, and I don't think that serves much of a purpose. I mean, I no problem trying to promote what I think is the right way to look at it, and if the world likes that approach, that's fine. If people like other approaches, I'm not going to argue them out of it.
That makes sense. So one person, Caleb asked, so do you think that we get too obsessed with causal inference sometimes in the social sciences? I'm thinking of examples where there is already an existing body of correlational studies that we may find persuasive. It seems like identifying the exact causal mechanism in such cases is perhaps less important, especially given that there may be microcauses behind that cause.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, often I think it's often more important to word questions as ones of conditional inference. I'm trying to think what the example was. The example is a undergraduate thesis I directed probably 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, on she had a data set and of high school graduates in the US. And the two variables that she was interested in, and she talked about it as she was in sociology, as I remember, were sex, male, female, versus race, Caucasian or other. And it had to do with ambition and achievement upon graduating high school or something like that. And at first she was framing it as cause. Which caused it? Was it sex or was it race that caused it? Of course, in my mind, it's neither, because unless really carefully worded, because each of those things is not trivial to manipulate, as if in a randomized experiment. But it doesn't make the questions any less interesting in some sense, because they're questions of conditional association. So what do I have to condition on to make the observed correlation or association go away? And those can be interesting questions, not because they imply an intervention or not, because the intervention isn't at all clear. But they still, if you think about it as conditional association, often the more you condition on, the more interesting the question becomes. And so in this example, what was the issue? Oh, I guess there was a huge sex difference for the importance of race in talking about high school achievement. And it wasn't a causal one. It's just that for females, conditioning on race made very little difference, but for males, conditioning on race made a big difference. And at the time, I think the data set was, I don't know, from back in the 80s or 90s. The reason seemed to be males had more into athletics, and so their heroes were more likely to be athletes if you were a black male than if you were a black female. So these conditional association questions certainly can be interesting. But I think using the word cause doesn't really help very much, because then you have to think, okay, how would I manipulate somebody's sex, or how would I manipulate somebody's race? What does it even mean?
Well, I think kind of the current move has partly reflected the realization that a lot of the questions ultimately are causal of what we're interested in. We're trying to affect policy and social sciences.
Correct.
Or we're trying to change things. And that's always going to involve questions of causality.
Correct, but often the kind of questions you can address by data sets you have access to are these conditional association, but which, if you make enough other assumptions, then you can make them into causal questions about which manipulation might work. I think one of the good examples of that, I don't remember the name of it now, but it's a paper that I wrote with Jim Greiner. On what the hell was the name? There's a case of in Georgia, I think, and it led to the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court back then about the death penalty. And because when considering guilt or innocence, you're not allowed to consider its other characteristics of the person. Has he done this before? Is he a bad person? Should you fry him to capital punishment or not, based on evidence? Did he really commit this crime only, or should you do that based on other crimes? And so the Supreme Court decided that the rules for capital for frying somebody, for executing them, were different than for did he commit the crime. And so and that's if Dalbert. It wasn't Dalbert. It's another one. Anyway, but the point of it is disentangling conditional association, which you can get from data sets, and what the implications are for various treatments, which is what causal inference refers to, can be disentangled. And I think it's useful too often.
So,
I don't know if that answered the question at all.
I think you did, and you also did go over some of other questions that we were supposed to ask you. So, how much time do we have left?
maybe one more question.
So, maybe for students or who are approaching causal inference, what do you think are the areas that are interesting for students to work on now?
One of I already mentioned, which is the interference stuff in network causality. I think we've just barely scratched the surface on that. But another set of questions I think has to do with human beings and the fact that causal inference as developed by Fisher and Neyman and Cochrane and George Box really was very effective working with inanimate objects, unconscious objects. And here's where sort of I guess some of the psychology background breaks in, and dealing with inanimate objects, they always do what they're told, but humans are so much more complicated. So I think one of the areas it's very important is dealing with the placebo effects and what's used to call Hawthorne effects. You know, effects because people are conscious, they're aware of whether they're taking a placebo or not. And in fact, I've written something in some obscure place in I think it's in a journal that's one of these startup journals, where I talk about how I think FDA for instance, they both approve drugs and approve doses based on placebo-controlled double-blind trials. And in fact, many of the drugs that have been approved over the past 20 years, 30 years, their doses have been ratcheted down in time as they've discovered too many negative side effects. And the issue here is if you both approve a drug, because it's got to be safe and effective, better than placebo in randomized trials, I have no problem with that. But then setting the dose based on the same kind of studies is wrong in my mind. Because when you go to a drugstore and you fill a prescription, you know you're getting an active drug. Your doctor's not prescribing some shit that doesn't work. So you're automatically getting the placebo effect in addition to the active effect of the drug. So therefore, you're overdosing. You're giving a higher dose than is necessary to get a target reaction. And that's not the way the world works right now. And I think it's a big mistake. So this paper that I wrote talked about how really you should be doing a multi-arm drug trials, where one arm is open label, one arm is placebo, and the other is active. So yet that you know whether you're getting, so you can actually disentangle the placebo effect from the active effect of the drug. So I think these kind of studies. Yeah. So go ahead.
Thanks very much. That's very interesting. I think I totally agree, kind of on both the counts, that the network settings and taking into account more the human nature of the subjects in many of the observational studies there are very interesting areas for further study. Also want to thank you for taking the time and doing this with us. Always great to see you. And I think this was super interesting for the audience. We had a huge audience today. So
great. I also want to thank all you guys for inviting me, because it gave me an opportunity to think about some of these things I hadn't thought in the same way about for a long time, if at all. So thanks very much for the invitation and the participation.
Thanks again for doing this, and thanks to the audience and the other panel members. And see you guys next week.
Thanks to all you guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Don.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, Don.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.